Hello and welcome to Learn with the Lords Question Time. Now, as I'm sure all of you know, today, the 8th of March, is International Women's Day, a chance to celebrate the achievements of women from all across the world and also to reflect on the challenges that women continue to face. So I am so excited today to be joined by a panel of inspirational women who sit in the House of Lords as baronesses. So a huge and really warm welcome to Baroness Hunt of Bethnal Green, Baroness Chakrabarti, Baroness Harris of Richmond and Baroness Newlove. So today's event is in two parts. To start with, our panel of leaders and experts are going to be discussing to what extent their gender has had an impact on their career. They'll also be discussing their experiences as female members of the House of Lords and also what feminism means to them personally. We'll also focus on the changing nature of feminism from the fight for the vote, which is known as the first wave, all the way up to the present day, and reflect on whether the movement remains united by a shared goal. So after the discussion, I'll be putting your questions to our panel. So make sure you're listening out for your school's name. I know that we have students joining us from all across the UK today. So thank you all so much for joining us and for submitting such fantastic questions for our panel. Really looking forward to putting those all to you in a little while. So without further ado, let's kick off this discussion. So we're going to start with a question for Baroness Harris, and then we will go from there. Baroness Harris, or Angela, could you tell us how being a woman you feel has impacted your career and your earlier life leading up to the House of Lords? Just on mute, Angela. Easily done.
Well, I started my career, my political career, when I was about 30 odd. Although at college I had been a member of the Undersecretary of the NUS at my college, so I was getting political even then. And even before that, I think my father had introduced me to politics as a little girl when I was about 5, sitting on his knee watching David Dimbleby do lots and lots of political shows. And I hadn't realised then, although of course subsequently I realised that my father was a liberal. And I think that sort of came through the pores as a child, you know. So it was a successive journey through to becoming a woman, looking at politics, getting involved in politics, seeing how men operated as well. And so when I became chair of my police authority hundreds of years ago, I was all ready for it.
Fantastic. How do you feel then, as the chair of that authority? Did you have any experiences that sort of set you apart as a woman, do you feel?
Yes, without doubt, Rebecca. I was very involved in a particular case that was happening, which was an explicitly sexual case that officers had been involved in, and were treating people very badly. But the men didn't seem to mind that, you know, initiation ceremonies, that sort of silly nonsense that men do. And one of our female officers was being treated extremely badly. And she really wanted to get out of this, but that would affect her career. In the end, she was so ill, she had to leave the police force because of it. And during the time, and it was huge nationally, the national papers were looking at it, and I had lots and lots of press involved, so that they would come to the police authority meetings as I sat next to the chief constable, a man at that time. And it was pretty hairy, because I then started getting very scary telephone calls telling me that I would be sorted out as a woman, and I should resign as chair of the police authority. Now, you know, I'm sorry, but that sort of behaviour from men is not acceptable. And I didn't fight it. I knew I was right. So we carried on. I carried on. I had support from a lot of very, very fine police officers. They're not all that bad. So very, very fine police officers who supported me and wanted me to stay. I did. We've got things turned around. We've now got a brilliant, absolutely brilliant female woman chief constable.
Oh, fantastic. So obviously what you were saying about those threatening phone calls is something that obviously a lot of women in positions of power experience now, but mostly on social media, I suppose. So it's
It wasn't in
potentially
my
even
day.
more.
We
No.
didn't have that in my day.
No, so it's still continuing just with through different
Oh, yes,
platforms,
absolutely.
which is so awful. Perhaps, Ruth, would you like to come in next?
Thanks, Rebecca. I think that, so I was born in 1980 in Wales, and I think in those days that I was really very aware of the fact that I was a girl growing up in a men's world, driven by my mum, I think. So my mum had left school at 18 and trained to be a nurse, then a midwife, but had then decided to do a PGCE and an MSc and an MBA and a PhD all around me and my brothers as kids. Do you know what I mean? So we were dropped off at nursery, and mummy was going to write her dissertation. So she kind of came to academia late, and as a feminist and a midwife saw that midwifery was absolutely the key to empowering women and introducing them to higher education, and it would transform families and communities. So that was the spirit. I don't think it was as kind of refined and polished as that, but that was certainly the ethos. And my dad was and is an incredibly gentle man. I think what disrupted some of my sense of kind of invincibility was I came out at 13, which in Cardiff was pretty tough, you know. But not only was I gay, but also and now even today have a penchant for very fine tailored suits and nice shirts and sharp ties and all that kind of stuff. So I was a bit too gay. Do you know what I mean? It not only was I gay, but I was a bit too gay. And came across a lot of inequalities, both as a woman and as a gay woman. So when I joined Stonewall in 2004, I think that my ambition then was to try and change hearts and minds, change how society works and change how things go. But I was really aware of the mentors in my life who were telling me very clearly that I would never work well in politics. I would never be an effective lobbyist because I was a bit too much. I was a bit too gay. My hair was a bit too short. I remember someone telling me that I should look to the women in the Lords and start wearing brooches. And I never quite got into, I never quite understood, you know, so accessorizing was never my thing, and I could never quite work out makeup. And, you know, if I wore a dress, I felt like I was Gandalf, you know, all that kind of stuff was going on. But this kind of message of, you know, you've got to be really careful, Ruth. As a woman, you've got to navigate this space in a better way than men have to. And I think I took that on board. I also took on board the shame that comes with that, inevitably, and kind of tried to navigate that space. So I guess now joining the House of Lords in that context and with that understanding, knowing that that actually I was quite good at influencing politics by the end. Like, even with my short haircut and my lack of brooches, I was still able to do it. I think I feel very gay again in a way. You know, the House of Lords is a very male institution with some absolutely incredible men and women with this heart of expertise that is so rich and deep. I feel very young. I'm 41 this week, and very gay, and a little bit, you know, yet to find my voice. And it's quite an interesting moment, I think, where I'm more aware of my gender and sexuality almost now than I was 5 or even 10 years ago. It's kind of, I feel a bit adolescent again, if you know what I mean, Rebecca. That kind of, I'm not quite sure who I am. So I'm rediscovering my voice again and working out how to use my power and my voice and my influence in the chamber as opposed to the work around it. But it's unusual to feel imposter syndrome again. I kind of thought I had that done and dusted within my 20s. So gender has inevitably has an impact on both my outlook, my understanding, and the way I navigate the world, certainly.
Oh, thank you. I think just to pick up what you were saying about appearance, I think that's really interesting, how that is such an important thing for a woman to look and dress in a certain way. I know with Margaret Thatcher particularly, there was all that narrative about her removing her pearls to appear more masculine. I might come to Helen at this point. I know you are a bit of a Thatcher fan. Don't have to talk about Thatcher. But do you think you could just tell us a little bit about how you feel your gender has had an impact on what you did prior to the House of Lords?
Yes, Rebecca. It's been really fascinating listening to Baroness Richmond, Harris, sorry, of Richmond, and Baroness Hunt as well, because there is some synergy, I think, with all of us in imposter syndrome. And I loved how you've put your introduction, Ruth. We've never met because with lockdown, it's gone chaotic. So we've missed lots of good friends and making new friends. But I think, I'm the same. When I came, my background has always been working in courts. My very first job was working in an advertising company, which actually was full of women, and it made me ill. They were horrendous to work with. Because I'd managed the jobs that I had and I was doing well, they didn't like that connectivity. And I was only 17, so this was my first role. And that kind of put me off. And then I got the opportunity to work in the courts in Manchester, and I just zoomed off. I just loved, I loved learning about what happens in the back room of courts, which, I did the old-fashioned charge sheets, and everything I've done, I've learned. I learned myself to type. I went to night school because my father was big on education. No matter what age, you can always, education was really important to my father, because we're from a very working class background. My mum had 2 jobs, my dad did. We had the most loving family, but it was, work ethic was right through, and education was so important. And actually how you talked, not that you were common, but actually people listen to the mouthpiece. So that's where you want people to, engage with you. And so for me, I felt very much that when I had my children and I was a legal PA, that was pinnacle. I've always been fascinated in law, and I love watching barristers. I love politics, but never thought I'd be in a world of politics at all. And I think that's quite, I've always been that way. I like a good debate, but never thought, have a seat in the House of Lords or anywhere, to be fair. So when I did, under my circumstances of losing my late husband, having a seat in the House of Lords was like, well, really, I'm not really sitting in the House of Lords. I've read about it in law books, which look very dry with these red seats, in the books, and grandeur, and it was all men, I have to say. All the previous law lords were men. So I just thought, I'm not this clever enough. So imposter syndrome again. And I did feel like one of these old-fashioned soap operas, that I'm, the way I speak. I'd went in an induction. They were all posh, lovely people. That is no disrespect to the people. They're lovely. But like Ruth, I'm thinking, I'm going back in myself instead of there's a reason why I was given this seat. And it took a lot of time before my mentor, you're given a mentor to help you around, because obviously I think it takes many years to know this place. It's crazy place because it's fast. It's just like a rabbit run everywhere, and procedures and constitutional ways of acting. And so my mentor is Baroness Morris, excuse me, of Bolton, and she's a good friend anyway. But when people ask you, and I don't know if Ruth gets this and may get this as well, or anybody, they ask why, how come you've come into the House of Lords? That's always the question. Well, I'm not from the Commons. I wasn't a local authority person, councillor, barrister, solicitor. And, if you just say the line, well, antisocial behaviour and most one was murder, it kind of stops the tracks. And they go, oh, yes. And then they don't know what to say. And then I don't know what to say. Do they understand antisocial behaviour? So it was my mentor who actually said, I'm going to slap you on the back, because, yes, Gary's story is very important, but it's your voice that's important. While you've got here the campaigning beforehand, the connections, the passion. And that day kind of turned. So when Ruth was just discussing about this imposter again, there will come a time when you turn again and you think, I have a right to be here. And especially when you make your maiden speech, that is so frightening. I've never made, with all these eyes on you, everybody locks down. It's like, I can talk about anybody and sell anybody, but not myself. It's really, I haven't got that confidence, believe it or not. But so that for me was really important. But from a working class background, I haven't changed. I don't believe I have. I've learned a lot more. I've met so many lovely friends, and I do have to say, and I've said this before, Rebecca, the House of Lords is the most respectful in the chamber. The way we produce legislation, the way we behave, we do consider one another whatever's going on in the outside world, we do actually go through lots of legislation to make it better. So that's where I come from, in a sense, and I'm still learning today.
Oh, thank you. I thought it was really interesting, Helen, what you were saying about mentoring and the importance of having those female figures to sort of help you through, and that sisterhood. I think that's really important. Shami, would you like to come in at this point? Just tell us a little bit about how being a woman has impacted your career.
No, I wouldn't like to come in because I'm just too overwhelmed by what I've heard. Incredibly authentic contributions and stories which you don't often hear in politics. Actually, there's a lot of showboating and acting, I suppose. In politics, it's sometimes quite demoralising to hear people. I mean, of course there should be debate and there should be rigorous debate, but sometimes there's a lot of false debate and false polarization, I think. But what I've heard is just so authentic. I mean, Helen and Ruth in particular, I've known their work before they came into the Lords as just incredible civil society campaigners. And of course, you know, we need more of them in the Lords, I think, not fewer. My own story is my parents came to London from India in the late 1950s. So not on the Windrush, but they're sort of an Asian equivalent of that sort of, you know, post-war generation of migrants. My father was a bookkeeper, my mother was a shop assistant, and it was hard for them, and they you know, in the 60s and 70s, for them lots of racism, really quite direct on street racism. They were beaten up by skinheads when they were pushing my pram in sort of 1970. But they also had a very idealized view of Britain and the legal system in particular. So I guess my connection with Helen is the law, and I eventually studied law at the LSE, and was called to the bar. And I think my feminism is something that sort of crept up on me through life. I was always concerned about injustice. The family was quite political. My parents were very encouraging. I think that seems to be a bit of a thread with all three of us, that our parents were encouraging in relation to education and finding your voice in particular. I think it's quite a common thread that often, for strong feminist women, they've had quite positive influence from their dads. That's often something I've noticed with you know, it so you know, I don't believe in sex wars. I ultimately believe that humans are collaborative. Of course there's conflict, but I don't believe in a battle of the sexes. I actually think that feminism, or ending sexism and structural sexual inequality, is as important for men as it is for women, because men are dying on battlefields and on the streets, and just like women are in the home, and so on and so forth. But I studied law. I went to the bar. I became more aware of the injustices of gender injustices as I got older in working and professional life. I saw at the bar in the 90s the very different ways that women were treated, even as a pupil barrister compared to men. Then I became a government lawyer, worked in the Home Office, and probably then really came to understand like proper workplace sexism. I once had a boss who, when we were debating what starting salary should be offered to a woman who came to join my team, another lawyer. She was older than me. She'd worked in private practice. She'd had some time out to have a family. And she was joining my team, and I was negotiating her salary, her starting salary, with my boss, a very senior government lawyer. And he said to me, well, what are her personal circumstances? And what he was getting at was that she should be paid less because she had a husband who could bring in the bacon, so to speak, and actually we should be paying the young men with families to support. And this was openly discussed in the Home Office, I'm talking about the late 90s. You know, at a time when the Home Office was actually responsible for equalities legislation. Anyway, after about 5.5 years there, I went to work at an organisation called Liberty, the National Council for Civil Liberties, initially as a lawyer, as in-house counsel, and a couple of years later, I became the director. And I would say, again, learning new things all the time, now much more public. I'd been a fairly anonymous civil servant, which actually suited me very well. I now had to be much more in the public square and do campaigning in the media and so on. And a lot of what was said and written about me became increasingly gendered. You know, there was a young man on the Times who, this was a big ouch for me. I think I was probably approaching my 40th birthday when a Times columnist wrote a whole page in the Times about my appearance, and I'm ashamed to say that it hurt me, but it did. And I was coming up to 40. You know, Ruth has sailed past all of this and looks 30 anyway, and it shouldn't, and none of this should matter, but it really did. For some reason, I was at a time in my life, and this guy, you know, this young Asian journalist on the Times, I'm almost naming him, but I'm not, just wrote this excoriating piece, and it was all about my appearance. And I don't believe that would have happened to a man. And equally, when I found myself criticising the new Labour government for some of their illiberal measures during the war on terror, there was a briefing operation to suggest that, because I was working on a cross-party basis, something that we do quite a lot in the Lords, by the way, because I'd done some campaigning with David Davis, who was then the Shadow Home Secretary, there was a briefing operation to suggest that I was having an affair with him. And I was at the time, you know, I was married with a small child. And again, that would never have happened to me, I believe, had I just been a chap, you know. And so as you get older, you come across this gender injustice in different ways. If you get involved in the reproduction business, there are new challenges that come with how people treat you as a mother and so on. And as to, anyway, eventually I did something I never thought I would do, and I joined a political party, and I came to the Lords, and that was very tricky too. Not least because my own party was bitterly divided during the last leadership, and so I did experience some pretty unpleasant things, but not in the chamber. I do agree with others, Helen and in particular, that the way debate is conducted in the chamber of the House of Lords is really very civilized and positive, and it lends itself, I think, to a thoughtful, constructive debate. What happens elsewhere is not always the same. There is power play. There has been bad behaviour. It has been reported. I've not always liked the way I've seen some members of staff be treated, etc., etc. We've got to come clean about that. But in the end, the quality of debate is often very high, and some of these courtesies that seem kind of old-fashioned actually lend themselves to, you know, calling people, you know, noble and learned and noble friends and learned lords seems ridiculous on one level, but on another level takes some of the heat out of what could otherwise be a very, very brutal politics.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing those experiences, Shami. I think we'll move on in a moment to focusing a little bit more on the curriculum, because that's partly what we're here to talk about. But I'll just hand over to Angela. Would you like to finish off this section of the discussion for us? I can see you've got your hand up.
Well, yes, thank you. I really, it's following on in a sense from what Shami's just said, because when I first went into the House of Lords in 1999, the old system was still in place. So it was full of elderly hereditary peers, hundreds of them, hundreds and hundreds of them. And I remember going into the library and trying to get through to the librarian. And all these old men were sitting in these low library chairs with their legs out, trying to stop me from moving. So I just kicked them aside. I hadn't worked for 20, 30 years with the police, not to see that as being grossly intimidating and incredibly bad. And I have to say, since those days, things have improved, albeit, as Sherry was saying, there is occasionally very bad behaviour. But I think we can now call it out and feel more confident that what we say will be heard and acted upon.
Well, that's really heartening to hear that things are improving, because that's something I think we do sometimes need to focus on. It's easy to sort of get lost in all the injustice and forget that things steadily are getting better. I think we'll move on now for a little bit more ideological stance, because in the politics A-level curriculum and in the modern studies curriculum, which most of the people watching us today will be studying, the focus is on feminism and the different branches of the feminist movement that can be conflicting. So I think I'll come to Ruth to start with this one, if that's okay. Could you just tell us a little bit about your relationship with feminism, and if you think there are any conflicts within the movement that we need to resolve?
I think there have always been conflicts in the movement, in the feminist movement. The feminist movement is always a hodgepodge of different movements. Sometimes there's a really interesting phrase called accidental adversaries, where feminists can become adversarial with each other, ignoring the bigger picture. And I guess the greatest feminist adversarial position I find myself in the moment is the discussion around trans inclusion and trans rights. And for me, bell hooks is my feminist of choice. Intersectionality, I know that's a jargonish word, but there is no freedom for women without freedom on the grounds of all sorts of other characteristics that are in our lives. And I think for me that the rights of trans people and the rights of trans women are part of my intersectional feminism, and to ignore that would be almost anti-feminist for me. That doesn't mean there's not areas of complexity. There are always areas that we need to resolve: sport, prisons, domestic violence centres. When does a toilet become a safe space, and when is it just a toilet? You know, all those kind of debates we can have forever. And one of the things I have been struck by, where I'd probably disagree with my noble friends, is that the debate last week, for example, there was a piece of legislation coming through that ostensibly granted rights to ministers to take maternity leave. It was a very small piece of legislation that very quickly became a debate about trans issues. And the reason it became a debate about trans issues is because this government rightly uses what's called gender neutral language. We don't use he or she, we use people. So pregnant people was the phrase. And those who are very against trans rights decided to use this as an opportunity to dispute trans rights, when in fact, this was not a trans rights issue. It had nothing to do with trans people. And what our trans audience saw was speech after speech after speech after speech of people saying, I'm not transphobic, but. And it was deeply distressing to watch, and I think didn't do our house proud, I don't think. But I think it's a real indication of the current schism that is existing in feminist communities, and those who believe that what's called biological determinism, those who are born women are the only people who can be women, and those who say that actually it's a bit more complicated than that. And there's lots and lots of space for debate, but I think that sometimes that debate has descended into cruelty, actually. And certainly I've had to lock down all sorts of different social media accounts. But I think, as I said at the outset, it is just the current example of splits. So my partner's a little older than me, and there used to be two women's bookshops in London, one for one type of feminist discourse and another for another, and you only went to the bookshop that assigned to your feminist discourse. And of course both have now shut down. So feminists have always been quite good at dividing amongst themselves. Lesbians were involved in big debates about what constituted proper sex for a long time. So this isn't new. But I think what it does is distract from the core issues here, which is we have a significant number of women in prison, a significant number of women in poverty, a significant number of women who are unable to feed their kids, a significant number of kids who don't have shoes to go to school. I mean, these should be the issues, domestic violence, that should be uniting us as women. And instead what happens is these schism issues at a great cost to a very small community that is the trans community, becomes the focus, and that it serves the current discourse in Britain well to fuel that division and fuel that culture war, rather than trying to find areas of commonality. So I'm right at the heart of a feminist row at the moment, Rebecca, I think, but I think we shall come through it.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. I think something a lot of the students watching will be aware of because of the involvement of J.K. Rowling and other like high-profile people within that debate. Shami, I can see you've got your hand up. Would you like to go next? Then we'll pass on to Angela.
I should take my hand down, shouldn't I? Because it will look weird. You know, when you're using your real hand, you know, sometimes on TV question time, people put their hand up and they get called and they're so nervous that they leave their hand in the air while they're talking. So I'm going to take my emoji hand down. I want to say to Ruth that you're not going to get disagreement from me about anything that you said, and I felt the same way about that stuff, that linguistic stuff last week. I speak as someone who was pregnant 20 years ago, and I was very grateful for maternity protection, but it was the maternity bit, not the woman bit, you know. And on this, I shouldn't do this, but I'm plugging a book that I wrote a few years ago called Of Women in the 21st Century, because in the first chapter of that book, I tried to set out what I think about this issue that has exploded ever since, with horrible Twitter wars, etc., etc. To quote Simone de Beauvoir, and I share your admiration for bell hooks. What is it? On ne naît pas, on devient. One isn't born a woman, one becomes a woman, right? That's a cis woman of X years ago, Simone de Beauvoir, talking about that. My understanding of my feminism, and going all pre-feminism, Mary Wollstonecraft, we're trying to raise women to be to the category of personhood that they were denied for so long. You know, that's even before first wave feminism. Second wave feminism, I thought, was supposed to be about getting over our biology, not being defined by our biology, and being able to take control of things like our reproductive bits, not to define ourselves and each other by our bits. You know, and so I passionately agree with Ruth about this. And the experiences of women, even cis women, are so different from one another. You know, a trans woman who's had a particularly tough experience may have far more in common with a cis refugee woman who's been abused and incarcerated than she has with some frankly posh, privileged cis woman. You know, so it's so reductive, I think, to you know, to constantly divide into levels of purity. You know, the idea that I would tell anybody how they can and can't define themselves, how they can see themselves, it's just astonishing to me. It's no different from saying, you come over here, you take our jobs. Right, it feels like racism to me, as someone who has experienced racism as well as sexism. This competition for victimhood, you know, because that's what it is, a competition for victimhood. You by being a trans woman, you're somehow coming into my ideological space. But we're not, you know, and I agree with Ruth, you know, if there are particular issues about who can be incarcerated together and who can be, those exist again across cis and trans lines. There's lots of case law from the Court of Human Rights about this. You don't put a white supremacist in the same prison cell as someone who looks like me, because guess what? I might not be very safe. And that's regardless of the bits. Or, you know, just to be blunt. But as for schisms in feminism, I mean, you know, the trans wars, so to speak, are the sort of latest iteration. But I agree, it goes way back. And for me, I think I recommended to you, Rebecca, a book, the latest Sylvia Pankhurst biography. And goodness me, doesn't that talk about the you know, it's almost the schism in the first family of feminism. You've got Emmeline and Christabel, who to some extent are much more famous, and then you've got Sylvia, and they essentially fall out over this idea of universalism and humanism versus it's just going to be women and it's just going to be our kind of women. We want the vote before the working class men. It would be awful for my driver or my butler to have the vote before me. So I'm fighting for women, but in a very, very pure Amazonian kind of definition of, and I'm not going to be for all people, whereas Sylvia is about working class women, working class men, black people, all people. And I have no doubt that in this current trans war, she'd be on the side of inclusion. Yeah. Because for me, you cannot separate feminism from your broader human rights view of the world, which is we want to treat all people with dignity. We want to address chronic inequality. And under COVID, more than almost any other time in my life, these inequalities and injustices are so exaggerated. And the idea that we'd be worried about semantics of whether you're a pregnant woman or a pregnant person, what we want is protection for people, for their lives and their dignity. So I mean, I'm not saying that we can't paper over the cracks. When there are proper policy disagreements that need to be sorted out, we can sort those out, but not in this very, it's almost baiting. Some of the stuff on Twitter, and people who should know better, grown up people who know how to string a sentence together, being sort of deliberately inflammatory and insulting. To me, it just reminds me of the racist experiences that I've had in my life.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really interesting discussion that we just had between Ruth and Shami there about the different conflicts in the present day and in the past as well. But a lot of our students will be studying particularly the conflicts between, say, liberal and radical feminism and this notion of patriarchy as well. So I wonder if, Baroness Harris, have you got anything to add about these splits within feminism? Where do you sit on the feminist spectrum? I think you're on mute, Baroness Harris.
Where do I sit? I think I'm a liberal feminist, probably. Is about it. I just wanted to say I was whipping for that debate where we gave essentially one minister permission to go off and have a baby, and frankly I found that very difficult. Very difficult indeed. What I found, as Shami and Ruth have said, was that the language was appalling. It was couched in beautiful English. It was all couched very, very gently and very reasonably and very, very but this is really, this is what we all feel, isn't it, everybody? And it made me feel ill, because we have, if that was where we are now, we are going backwards. And we absolutely have to address those bits of language, how we use things, how we talk to each other. It's, in the end, it boils down to universal human rights. In the end, that's really what it's about. Is all I wanted to say. Sorry. Yeah. And I so appreciated what Ruth and Shami said there, because they felt like I did. I nearly went off to be sick.
Thank you, Angela. Sorry. Thank you for adding. No, thank you. Helena, just before we move on to students' questions, so for the last minute or so before we move on to that, is there anything you'd like to add about your relationship with feminism, any conflicts that you found in your life with the movement?
I have to say, I've not seen myself as a feminist or got too het up in it, if you get my meaning. In my background, I didn't really come onto that in a sense, but then when you look at it now, when you're educated, I think feminism, the word, has been spread too thin and it's got too many divides. So you're either, like Ruth was saying, you're either in one or the other. and I wasn't listening to the bill that's been discussed about maternity. I feel very sick as a mother of 3 daughters that we've had to have a bill in the first place for something that's natural. And every other workplace, you can go off this maternity allowance and all this. To have a bill to discuss somebody to go on leave, I think is absolutely just disgraceful. Do you do that for a man who needs a hernia, or does the minister need to be off for a broken knee? The fact is, this is human nature at its most loving, if that's how you want to look at it, no matter what sex or whatever. But I find that very sickening that you have to have this legislation so it looks okay. And then we're trying to do the PC world. And, I'm going to be honest, I prefer mother because that's just me. But that doesn't mean to say I hate the other rhetoric of whatever. I wasn't putting one or the other. That's just who I believe, because what I'm looking at furthermore, which, I've got no issue with anybody. Everybody, what you want to do is fine. That, if you feel that you need to do that and you're better for your mental health, whatever, I haven't got an issue. But what I do worry about is further down the line where it becomes clinical and non-emotional because people are scared. We've got to break this down, and I think it's too fast. All the work that Stonewall has covered and everything, and women, we need better conversations about this instead of homing in and having this debate that loses the essence of this is about a baby coming into a world of, we're actually saying, well, your mother couldn't have the leave, love, or whatever. I don't know the context, but for me, listening, and I agree, you're homing on the transgender, where actually it isn't their debate. And there's people, I've met many in the banking world, all different worlds, and they're just like you and I. They're not monsters. They're just people who, I just want to get on with their lives and be recognised and be loved and everything like that. And I say it not to be blasé, because I don't do that. But I think what's happening is the media builds up this drumbeat of, it focuses on one thing. You forget what the essence of this bill is about. But more importantly, it should have been a bigger debate of saying, why do we need this?
Yeah.
Why do we need this for us to go on leave? It's absolutely disgusting in the 21st century. All the women beforehand who have fought for maternity rights, and women judged, oh, she's going to go off and have a baby, so we won't hire her. What do I say to my 3 girls? And my 3 girls, if they knew about this, they'd be calling politicians saying, well, how dare you discuss? If I want to go off and have a baby, I'm happy to do that. Why should I be judged because of that? So that's the bit I'm getting. The more I hear about it, I wish I did listen to it. I'll have to read Hansard now to say it. But it's, it's for Ruth to stand up and debate. It's not very nice. We need a balance. And there is a lot of cultural issues, both in the divide of very wealthy, not wealthy, how they live their lives, how they still see women, in the chamber from, there is still that archaic picture, and I think it would have been interesting, but how sad to have this debate and piece of legislation. I kept thinking, what is the minister bit, Angela, on the front? I think, well, what's the minister there? It's maternity. Yeah. Now I know why, because I was doing my day job at university, but now I'm really going to get the Hansard and say, I hope somebody did say, well, we've had to, why we're having that in the first place.
Thank you so much, and thank you as well, all of you, for picking up on the this current issue of maternity, because a few of the schools that wrote questions in focused on that, so that's really, really good. So without further ado, I think we'll move on to some questions from our students, and we're going to kick off with a really, really good one from Sydenham High School in London, and I'm going to ask each of our panel to just answer this in one really short sentence, if that's okay, because I'd love to hear from all of you on this one. And it's just, what does International Women's Day mean to you? So I'll start with Shami. Would you like to give your one sentence answer to this for me?
It's the day when we commemorate all those who came before us in the struggle and resolve to come together to do better in the struggle for gender justice going forward. Thank you very much. Ruth, would you like to go next?
20 centuries of patriarchy, and we get one day when everyone else gets a week every year. I think we could up our ambitions a bit, my friends.
Nice, like it. Helen, do you want to go next?
I think it's recognising all the history of the strength that women have had to fight. And so to International Women's Day isn't about what we speak about, it's recognising every individual soul that had to fight to be recognised around that table, and we have to salute them and never forget them.
Thank you very much. Angela?
It's every year to see how far women have progressed from the last one, how far we've come, but also to remember how far we still have to go.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you, Sydenham High School, for that question. That was a lovely one to start us off. We're going to move now to a question from King's Education Oxford and Leith Academy in Edinburgh. And that is the House of Lords representative of women, minorities and young people? And then interestingly followed up with, to what extent does it matter if Parliament is representative, which I think is really interesting. Ruth, would you like to come in on that one?
It's not, and it does matter, because the spread of expertise across the House of Lords means you need those different perspectives. But the House of Lords, and I've not yet found anyone who disagrees with this, but I don't quite know the answer. It's too big. It doesn't really, it's not fit for purpose anymore. It needs some reformation, and within that we need to reflect on different experiences. I'm very aware that there are very, very few people of colour in the House of Lords. I've also noticed that when we all overrun in our time, but when people of colour overrun in their time, the impatience in the chamber is more tangible. There's something about how our courtesy, civility can often mask prejudice, and I think we should be more open about that. So I would love to see more women, younger people, but also general reformation of the House of Lords as well. But I do not for a moment underestimate the sheer expertise that sits in many of those members, and that's a very important element of our second chamber function, I think.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you as well to King's Education and Leith Academy for that question. Now, this next question was very, very popular, so I'll rattle through all the schools that asked it so everyone gets a shout out. So it's from St Edward's School in Poole, the Swain Park School in Essex, Bedford Sixth Form, Bishop Stortford College, Esher Church of England High School in Surrey, the King's School in Canterbury, and East Sussex College. So very, very popular question. 34% of MPs and 28% of peers are women. So what do you think could be done to encourage, enable and increase the number of women in Parliament, particularly BAME women? Shami, I'll come to you for this one, if that's okay.
Affirmative action is what has worked in the Labour Party in relation to, for example, women-only shortlists in certain seats, and increasingly in seats, you know, what you might think of as a winnable seat for the Labour Party. It was very controversial in its day, but it has been a game changer, and the proportion of women in the Commons has been greatly enhanced by the Labour women only shortlists proposition, and really in the second chamber, because it is an unelected chamber, there's really no excuse, because under the current system, peers are appointed. There's really no excuse for being even behind the democratically elected House in terms of representation. But affirmative action, even if it's time limited, just to kickstart the change. That is, I didn't always believe in that when I was in my 20s. I didn't, but now I'm in my 50s. Guess what? I'm a little bit more impatient for change. I wonder why that is.
Thank you so much. We'll move on next to a question from Durham International Study Centre and St Catherine's College in Surrey. And I'll put this one to Helen, if that's okay, Helen. And that's, do you think women MPs and peers are treated equally to male MPs and peers in Parliament? St Catherine's College, as well as an additional note, added that they've noticed that the House of Commons is often criticised for how female MPs are treated, and they want to know how your experience compares to those MPs in the House of Commons, if that's okay.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. As not being in the House of Commons, as an observer watching, I think it's absolutely, I feel sometimes very demeaning to be a woman in the way they're treated in the House of Commons. I think that, you know, especially it seems that approach where we've said enough and shut up. And also, I think where you're having to shout to be heard in a civilized society today is absolutely horrendous. So we shouldn't have to do that. And I have to say that men speak longer in the House of Commons than women do. I do feel that's representative. So as to how you feel, I think to be a woman MP, I do think it's a very clinical approach. It's time consuming, and you are up against men as well. So there's I've got friends who try to be MPs, And I bow down to them, because the cynicism from men saying, well, you don't really think, do you, you're going to get elected? You know, that's still the culture in the back essence that we're not seeing. In the House of Lords, I've not been treated any differently, but I can see there is a domination with the men sometimes in the debates, where they again don't shut up. Basically, they go on, and there's this kind of boys' network where they get up, and they've done it for years, and it's not filibustering, but it's like an old boys' club when they get up. And I get really frustrated where I've called a debate on domestic abuse, and the constitution, the way the timings are, you get 2 hours. Where the EU debate, all being a huge area for discussion, we have 3 hours and the House is full, full of men who want to stand up and orate. And for me, that shows you an imbalance of what is important and what's not important. And that comes down to, mostly women are in domestic abuse situations. So I've not come under it, but if I feel I'm being snubbed, I'm a gobby northerner. So but I do think there's also some individuals where there's a class divide. And women are also doing this as well to women. So it's not just men. There's also a class divide with women in the sisterhood, where you can see it. And I'm very loyal, and I just don't like where I must fit in. I want to fit in, but you must fit in and go with it. I don't really like. It makes me feel very sick. So that's just my opinion in what I feel.
Thank you so much. Angela, I'm going to put this next one to you, because you mentioned you joined the Lords in 1999, so I think this will be a great question for you. It's from Aquinas College in Stockport, so thank you for this. Does it make any difference to the character of the Lords Chamber, the nature of debate and the quality of decision making, that there are more women in the Lords than ever before?
Well, I would definitely say yes, wouldn't I? It has changed markedly since I went there in 1999. So it's a long time, 20 odd years. And definitely women are now much more confident of getting up and saying what they want to say with as much clarity and sense as men do, because they talk a lot of nonsense a lot of the time, to be honest. But the difference is that men are more aggressive. And I have noticed another thing that I've noticed in the years between is that the men who have come over from the House of Commons are definitely more aggressive in the House of Lords than we have ever had before. And I think that has, if I say lowered the tone, I don't mean that in a terribly pejorative. Well, yes, I do mean it in a pejorative way. They have reduced the level of debate to more of a shouting match, and they've also some have brought in, very much so, attacks against people within the chamber. So personal attacks, making personal comments. And as Helen has said, it just doesn't apply to men. Some of the women are doing it as well now. And that can be very, very harsh. The atmosphere has changed. In the last 5 years, the atmosphere has changed in the House of Lords because of that. At least that's what I've found.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This next question is one that I've thought about quite a lot, actually, since working at Parliament. So I'll put this to Ruth, if that's okay. It's from East Sussex College. And that is the House of Lords an appropriate name for a second chamber of the 21st century? And what would you change it to if you think it should be changed?
Well, it is a bit daft, but it's not on my top list of things that are a bit daft in some of our rules. Interestingly, Lords is a gender neutral phrase. I suspect that wasn't the plan when they came up with it, but when we referred to my lords, we're referring to everybody in the chamber. And there's a really interesting little room just off the Lords called the ladies' room, which I use as a place to kind of get some work done because my office is somewhere else. And that used to be the room where women got changed, their wives got changed. And in the top, there's the ladies' balcony where the wives could go and watch their men proceed. So Lords, I suspect when women came in, Lords just became this gender neutral phrase, which I quite like, because it means if someone non-binary came into the House of Lords, then the title Lord would be perfectly adequate. So we are in a way much more modern, but I doubt it's by design. We need a modern second chamber. We need that scrutinising capacity, and that should be what it says on the tin, that the second chamber is a scrutinising panel, legislative. But I'm a bit too green to know how to achieve that. So the Lords just remains one of those very camp things of the words we use, a bit like the chapel in the Lords and the Commons is the most high camp religious prayer. I'm Christian, and it's just all glitz and glam. So there is something about us that is a little bit glitz and glam. But I do quite like the fact that the Lords is applicable to non-binary peers when they come.
Yeah.
Call us a Senate, Ruth.
Yeah, a Senate. Yeah, it needs, everything needs going up a gear.
Yeah.
And it's time, I think. Even the building is collapsing around us through old age. It's not a very subtle metaphor. So we do need to up our game a little bit.
Yeah, modernise a little bit. Thank you. We've got a question now from Woodhouse Grove School, which is comparing a little bit the UK and America, which I think is really interesting. So maybe Shami, if you'd like to answer this one. So we've had obviously 2 female prime ministers now. How soon do you think we will have a 3rd female prime minister? And in global politics, why have we not yet have a woman US president? So big question.
So to take the second bit first, the hardest part first, why not a woman in the US? I think that American politics is very money driven. You need a hell of a lot of money to even be a credible candidate for the US presidency, and the campaign and the candidacy is all about you. It's a presidential system. It's all built behind this one commander-in-chief figure, and it doesn't lend itself generally to radical change or even progressive change. It lends itself to big money interests who are going to go for somebody that they know, and they it's so I think that's partly been the problem, that the money in the American system, and it's become a bit more like that in Britain, I'm sorry to say. That money has become more and more important in even people's party leadership campaigns, let alone their elections after that. As to when we'll have the next woman prime minister, I have to say with some embarrassment, it's about time my own party had a woman leader. I think it is it is an embarrassment to me, and should be an embarrassment to the Labour Party, that we've yet to have a woman leader. Not because you have to be a woman to be a feminist, but it's just it's supposed to be a party of equality, and it's done all sorts of good things for equality, but not to have had a woman leader it's frankly embarrassing. I think, and no doubt the Liberals probably feel that way too. That that they need to have better. They need to have a woman leader too, and we need to get to a place where this is just completely commonplace, and that it almost just naturally alternates. And maybe I'm being old-fashioned, because, as Ruth might say, well, we might end up with non-binary leaders and prime ministers in the not too distant future. But certainly to date, there's not been sufficient representation. The final point to make is just having women at the top is necessary, but certainly not sufficient, because it's very easy to be a woman prime minister and to sit or to be on a board, to be a woman CEO, or sit at the board, but not at the top tables of power, not think about the people serving at that table, cleaning and building that table, scrubbing those floors. So these things are all necessary symbols, but they're not sufficient if the women who get to that position of power kick the ladder away and don't actually think about the structural and policy changes that you need for all men and women to build a more equal community.
Yeah, thank you. Ruth, do you want to come in on that, because you've got your hand up?
just very briefly, because I know time is tight, I think there's also something about how much I never led a career, a life as a politician. So when I was at university, there were aspiring politicians there who were leaving the house party as soon as a spliff got lit, and really mindful of their future political career. And I think that there is an expectation of women to be absolutely acceptable to society with no blemishes on their record before they can go into politics. And I think those demands are higher than they are for men. Put that extra layer on becoming a leadership candidate, I think that it becomes even more difficult. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something about the expectations we place on our potential politicians that is more complexly applied to women, that is off-putting. If I was 16, 17 now, I wouldn't necessarily want a career in politics because I wouldn't want the scrutiny that comes with it. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot we have to do around social media, around how women are treated in politics before women feel incentivized to join, let alone lead, would be my view.
Thank you very much. Angela, do you want to make a really brief point on this before we move on to the next question?
I shall just say 2 words: Kamala Harris.
Thank you very much. 2 very well chosen words. I think we'll move on then to a question from Holcombe Grammar School in Kent and Kenilworth High School in Warwickshire. And I think, Shami, I'll come to you on this just because you picked up on it in the discussion earlier. And that's, what's your view on positive discrimination to ensure equal representation of women in Parliament and minority groups in broad society? So, for example, with university admissions and that sort of thing.
So I do now, in principle, support the use of affirmative action in certain areas where they're needed, because the status quo on the planet is not a meritocracy. Mm-hmm. Okay, we, 5 of us, are even in a terrible pandemic, are sitting in relative safety in one of the wealthiest countries on earth, with I'm hoping that Angela's had maybe a jab. I haven't had one yet, but I've have an expectation of having one in the next few months. We are so fortunate compared to so many other people on the planet, not because we're cleverer, not because we're better, but because there is structural inequality on the planet, and there's structural inequality in our society too. And so if you take that view, and I do take that view, then it becomes important, legitimate, and even vital to take positive measures to kickstart that change. So I've suggested, for example, affirmative action in the form of all women shortlists to improve the representation of women in the House of Commons, but I would also do it in the workplace. And by the way, I would do it in both directions. There's a lack of young men in primary education, and having more young men teach in primary schools could be really good for our little girls and boys in terms of seeing a different kind of male leadership. It's not just Donald Trump and Boris Johnson and generals of armies. It's also that, that other kind of masculinity, the teacher, the nurturer, the carer. So if there's a lack of women in the primary school, I would use affirmative action 1 year to improve that. I think there are lots of chief constables who would be grateful for the legal opportunity. It's currently illegal, but they'd be grateful for the opportunity to have affirmative action to recruit more black police officers, so that there's a greater relationship between those doing the policing and those being policed. Targeted use of affirmative action, sometimes on a time-limited basis, just for a couple of years, you can kickstart change and really start seeing people moving into parts of the economy and parts of society that they've not been in before. I think that would be, that's my view.
Thank you very much. So in the last sort of 5 minutes or so, we're going to move on to some questions that are more about gender inequality in society rather than just contained within politics and parliament. So we'll move to a question from the Sir Thomas Boteler School. I hope I pronounced that right, in Cheshire. Helen, I'll come to you for this one, if that's okay. And it's a fantastic question, really, really good one. Why are there far fewer statues of women than men? So according to a 2016 article by Caroline Criado Perez, the author of Invisible Women, great book, there are only 25 statues of historical non-royal women in the UK. There are 29 statues of Queen Victoria alone and 498 statues of historical non-royal men. So Helen, what's your view on why this is and how we can maybe change that?
I must get that book, Invisible Women. I've written so many books down here. It's crazy. I think historically, the fight, if you look at what we're talking about today, International Women's Day, recognising the fight women had, they were this, they were the lower class in whatever, even if you were wealthy, you were still, that kept woman. You had no voice. If you look at bank accounts, you had no rights to money, you had no rights to anything. So, I've not gone into this deeper, but I would imagine it's because of history. We also recognise these men of wealth, of character. Actually, somebody just shaking a hand really to get a statue up, which in the 21st century we still do it behind the scenes. There's other a way of doing this, but I think that is why Queen Victoria was a very powerful monarch in her own right. And in fact, Queen Victoria, when she lost Prince Albert, that's why the doorkeepers wear their uniform today, because that was of the death of Prince Albert. So it's even, the men have to wear that uniform, which I love. I think it's really great when you bring people, but it must be horrendous to wear in the heat and everything. So, that. But for me, it seems to be everywhere is men. However, we have got globally, we've had men tortured. Look at Mandela, all them. They didn't have any. They were imprisoned for activism, and so for me, I think it's a very good question that we need to really delve in more. I think we should recognise women, but if you look at some of the statues, they don't look as huge as the men statues. Like they look chest raising out or whatever. Where Emily Pankhurst's statue in Manchester is very. It's there and it's really, it's really proud, but I'm just thinking she could be more powerful than just the standout she is, because, they went through hell to get what they did, from starvation. So for me, that's it's very interesting question, to be honest. And I'm going to definitely read that book to have a better answer for next term.
Oh, thank you so much. So we'll move on to our final three questions now to try and squeeze these in. It's a question from Durham University International Study Centre again, and Archbishop Holgate School in Yorkshire. I think I'm going to put this one to Baroness Harris, if that's okay. So to you, Angela, why do you feel that some women are choosing not to identify as feminists, do you think?
I wish I could give you an answer to that, Rebecca. Years and years ago, I remember talking to a large group of women police officers, trying to encourage them, and they were all PCs, and I couldn't understand this. They were simply women police constables. They hadn't aspired to go up to being a sergeant or an inspector, etc. And I asked them why. And they all looked a bit sort of bashful. I mean, some of them said, obviously, well, we want to have children, or we have children, and it's difficult to get time on. And of course, it's all of that. Of course, I understand that. But it shouldn't now be holding women back. And I think that somewhere along the line, we've got to try and change what is still embedded as a culture to break through that and get people all over the place recognizing that women can do and should be doing in everything that they want to do within their biological confines, and to be able to have their families as well. So I definitely would, and I think it's a very good question from Durham. So I would throw it back at them, and I would say, what is stopping you? What do you find are the difficulties in choosing not to identify as a feminist? And what's next for us? Well, maybe the fourth wave. We haven't got there yet, have we? We're still talking about that, because that can be very contentious, or not. Discuss.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We've got a question from Oldham High School in Hertfordshire, which is really focused on the A-level and Scottish High curriculum. So I'm going to throw this to Ruth and Shami because they've mentioned a couple of the people on this list already. So Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Simone de Beauvoir, Bell Hooks, Sheila Rowbotham, and Kate Millett are key thinkers that learners have to quote and show an understanding of during their politics A-level. Do you think any other authors should be included, and who do you admire most of the 5 that we've mentioned? So Shami, would you like to go first?
I don't particularly want to set up a hierarchy of these great women, because that doesn't,
understandable.
in a way, that almost doesn't seem like a feminist thing to do. And I just couldn't. I did think about this a lot, but I can't set, I can't. There's a relationship between them. There's a through line in the thinking, but there are lots of others that you could add to your list throughout the ages and around the world. I'd like to maybe add, I don't know, Rosa Luxemburg, Toni Morrison, Eleanor Roosevelt, people who've made contributions to our understanding of each other and injustice and the world, and ultimately, human rights people, great women. But I wouldn't like to do. I think I once was in a balloon debate for Women's Hour, where we had to play great feminists, and it was a balloon debate, and you had to try and win and be the last woman in. And I think I actually played Emmeline Pankhurst, which is like so wrong actually. Now years later, I wish it had been Sylvia, but someone else was Mary Wollstonecraft, and with people getting chucked out of the balloon. But I don't actually think that chucking people out of balloons is a very feminist approach to discussing our history. But those names, but the names on that list are all great, and everybody's limited in part by their time. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, for example, was an amazing thinker and writer, and on the one hand she's writing like science fiction, but on the other hand she might be the mother of feminomics, and writing, even when she did, about a woman's labour not being remunerated and so on. But she said some pretty racist things. But then maybe that's of the time, and so you have to. But I wouldn't put them in a hierarchy. But there's lots more there. I think Toni Morrison's worth a read. Again, it is amazing when people can write beautiful fiction and literature, as well as political and philosophical thinking. So I think she's probably worth definitely adding to the list.
Thank you so much. Ruth, is there anyone you'd like to add quickly before we move on to our last question?
I'd definitely add Audre Lorde. I don't quite know why she's not on the A-level curriculum yet. Come on. And Rebecca Solnit is a very good contemporary feminist. And I'd also add Judith Butler, actually. Not her early stuff that I had to wade through in my degree. It's a bit heavy going. And I could go on at length about why she wrote in that way.
Is Wendy somebody, Judith Butler's partner?
I can't remember her name, but Judith Butler now writes in a very accessible way. So definitely look up Judith Butler now, Rebecca Solnit now, and Audre Lorde. Just get her on the curriculum.
Brilliant. Thank you. So some great names for you to add, all of you watching, to your study. So stand out from the crowd without adding some new authors into your essays. So we're going to move on to our final question now. And just as I asked you for one sentence with the first question earlier about International Women's Day, I'm going to ask you for one name to finish up. So this question is from Belfast Royal Academy and Turton Sixth Form College in Bolton. Who is your favourite female role model? So I'm just going to ask for one name for each of you to finish off. So Baroness Harris, would you like to go first?
Hillary Clinton.
Thank you very much. Helen, I'll come to you next.
Mine's Margaret Thatcher.
Thank you. Shami.
Come back to me.
Ruth.
Well, composite role models are important, Rebecca, but I will give you one name. And I'd nominate Reverend Mfo Andrea Tutu, Desmond Tutu's daughter, openly gay, minister in the church, a pretty incredible woman who is fighting the good fight.
Thank you.
Okay, I was given grace and time by Ruth there. Thank you very much. I think to fly the flag for women in the law, which is, and it's not always been an easy path. I'll put a shout out for Brenda Hale. I think who was our first Supreme Court woman.
Oh, loads of nods to finish there. Thank you,
Rebecca. Do we have time for me very, very quickly to just read a very bit of a poem by Maya Angelou, that Hillary Clinton mentions in her book, What Happened?
Yes, of course.
Is there
please
time?
do.
Sorry, and Rebecca, can I finish with a quote that I really like finishing with? Is that all right? Sorry.
Yeah, go on then. We've already gone a bit over time, so go on then. Why not?
So Maya Angelou writes as part of a poem, "You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise."
Thank you. Helen, would you like to share your quotes?
Yes, because my other person I admire is Eleanor Roosevelt. But I always, when I go to conferences or speak, especially when I'm in schools with young women, my favourite quote is, "A woman is like a tea bag. You can't tell how strong she is until you put her in hot water." And I think that is really appropriate to get them interested, to have a debate, and their voice matters.
Thank you so much. Well, what an incredible way to celebrate International Women's Day. Thank you all so much for joining us today. That was such a wonderful discussion, so insightful. And thank you to all of you watching for your fantastic questions. I think our panel really enjoyed answering them, so thank you so much. Just to keep up to date with all the exciting things that are happening for International Women's Day and Women's History Month, make sure you follow the Education Engagement team on Twitter at UK Pol Education, and just check out our website for more details. But thank you all so much for joining us again, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.